For this one, you know that secant is 8 and tangent is 3 radical 7. And we have to find cosecant. One thing to remember is that tangent is equal to sine of theta over cosine of theta. So, this would be helpful here. Knowing that secant is a reciprocal of cosine, we know that cosine of theta is 1 over 8. So, tangent of theta, 3 radical 7, equals sine of theta, which we don't know yet, over cosine of theta, which is 1 over 8. To solve for sine of theta, we'll just multiply by 1 over 8 on both sides. And then we get that sine of theta is 3 radical 7 over 8. Now, cosecant is 1 over sine of theta, or the reciprocal of that, which means that cosecant is 8 over 3 radical 7. To rationalize the denominator, you have to multiply by radical 7 on the top and on the bottom, and you're left with 8 radical 7 over 21. For this problem, we used what are called reciprocal and quotient identities. Today we're going to be learning about Pythagorean identities. These three identities listed at the top are called Pythagorean identities. And you can think of them almost like the Pythagorean theorem of a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's almost like on the unit circle, y squared plus x squared equals the radius squared, which is just 1. Now, the one on the left, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, is the most important, and it's the one that you should think of in how to figure out the two on the right. So, one thing you can do to figure out the two on the right is just divide everything by, I don't know, say cosine squared. So if we divide all that, sine squared over cosine squared is just tangent squared, plus cosine squared over cosine squared is 1, and then 1 over cosine squared is secant squared. Look what we've done here. We derived that Pythagorean identity. You can try it yourself. If you divide everything by sine squared instead of cosine squared, guess what? You'll get this one over here. So when memorizing these Pythagorean identities, the most important one is sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And then if you divide by sine squared or cosine squared, you'll get the other two. In this problem, we're given that tangent is negative 8 and sine is positive, and we're asked to find the values of sine and cosine. So, since we know that tangent is negative 8, what we want is the Pythagorean identity that uses tangent. So we'll be using this second one because it has tangent in it. So let's plug in values we know. Tangent is negative 8, so we have negative 8 squared plus 1 equals secant squared. Negative 8 squared is, of course, 64, plus 1 gives you that secant squared is 65, which means if you take the square root on both sides, you get radical 65 is the value of secant. Now, we also know that cosine is the reciprocal of secant. So, we get that 1 over radical 65 is equal to cosine. And of course, rationalizing the denominator, radical 65 over radical 65, we know that cosine is equal to radical 65 over 65. Now, we're going to have a little more work to find sine. And in order to find sine, we have to remember that tangent is equal to sine over cosine. So now let's plug in what we know. Tangent's negative 8. We're looking for sine. And cosine is radical 65 over 65. To solve for sine, we just multiply by radical 65 over 65 on both sides. These will cancel, and you're left with sine of theta equals negative 8 radical 65 over 65. Now, we run into a slight problem here with the sine, because in the original problem, it says that sine is positive. Now, remembering that sine has to be positive, and that our original cosine was negative, that only leaves us one option here, is that cosine has to be negative. So, how could cosine be negative, you ask? What a crazy idea. Well, remember when we took the square root here? This really means that secant is plus or minus radical 65. And this whole thing could be either positive or negative. But in our case, it means cosine is negative, and this sine we had here is going to be positive. Because essentially we'd multiply by a negative for the cosine, negative here, and that goes to positive. So, the answers are cosine is negative radical 65 over 65, and sine is positive 8 radical 65 over 65.